Chapter 8 Modern Day Dante. One of the luxuries of my time working for a small community hospital was that I was able to practice my chaplaincy in both hospital and hospice settings at the same time. They're different kinds of work. By and large, hospital patients have hope of recovering from illness and resuming their lives, albeit with some modifications. Not so with hospice patients. Hospice patients realize there is no recovery. So working in a small-town hospital afforded me the privilege of building relationships with people in the hospital before they were facing a crisis. I first met Billy when he was a patient at the hospital. He was affable, gravelly-voiced, and full of stories. Most patients I met at the hospital were not too eager to spend time with a chaplain, not Billy. He seemed genuinely pleased to see me. As soon as I introduced myself, he said, "Praise the Lord, I'm a Christian. I love Jesus with all of my heart. How about you?" During the visit, Billy told me his body was falling apart. His kidneys, his heart, his lungs, nothing was working right. So it was no surprise when I got the call a few weeks later and learned that Billy would be coming on to our hospice service. When I arrived at Billy's house for the initial hospice visit, he was watching some television preacher on a religious channel. I noticed a large glass of red wine on the coffee table and a 12-pack of beer next to Billy's chair. It was only 4 in the afternoon, but it smelled like Billy had been drinking for a while. Billy turned off the televangelist and began to regale me with stories of being in Okinawa during World War II. He spoke of how relieved he was when we dropped the big one on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, since it meant he wouldn't be deployed to Japan in the effort to take the island by ground force. Many lives were saved, he said over and over, justifying the use of atomic weaponry and minimizing his own fears of being deployed in a continued war effort. He told me the cabin where he lived had once been a tavern, the old Cedar Inn. It had been given to him years ago by the owner, Jimmy Swinehart, who explained to Billy, "I'm just paying taxes on it now anyway." The old abandoned tavern was falling in on itself, so Billy tore much of it down and rebuilt the remainder into his home. "The bar was over there where my bed now is," he said. Billy had lived in this makeshift cabin for more than 50 years. Billy had 3 children, 2 of whom he didn't see very much. He told me all families have spats from time to time. Why can't everybody just get along? Joyce, the one daughter Billy still spoke to, lived just a stone's throw from his cabin. I remember the day I met Joyce. She tearfully told me about her father's alcoholism and how he had abused her, her sisters, and her mother. When she was only 8 years old, Joyce and her siblings had to sit outside the bar in the car on Saturday nights, sometimes until 5 in the morning, waiting for their dad to come out and begin the dreaded drunken drive home. Although her sisters wanted nothing to do with her father, she was still devoted to him, the only one willing to take care of him. She never married. Once I got to know Billy, I learned that it was best to visit him in the morning. Billy had an inviolate law that he wouldn't start drinking before noon, so I wanted to try to speak with the sober Billy. One morning, with Bob the dog lying on the floor next to his feet, Billy was retelling some of his favorite stories, old stories from his war days, stories from his early days here in Oregon, stories about all his old drinking buddies that were now dead. As I listened, I noticed the yellow-crusted toenails on his swollen feet, which he kept elevated on a torn ottoman in a vain effort to limit the swelling. For some reason, I thought of Dante and his Divine Comedy, which I'd been reading the night before. I was enthralled by how Dante created his epic poem in an effort to explain his own reality. particularly the pain and devastation caused by the conflict between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, medieval Democrats and Republicans who fought with swords and muskets, not just words. I was thinking about how this inspired Italian poet from the 14th century had given his life to creating a meta-story, a myth, to make sense of his reality, and how this story had helped make sense of reality for many wounded people down through the centuries. Now here was this modern-day Dante, trying to do the same thing. Billy was trying to create a story that would give meaning to his pains, his failed dreams, and his flawed humanity. Billy was desperate to make sense out of the chaos that was his life. On a whim, I asked Billy what story he would most want his buddies to remember him by. If I was sitting with all your drinking buddies and asked them to tell me a story about you, what would you want them to tell me? Billy looked as if I had slapped him in the face. He couldn't say anything. I pressed him, but he wouldn't give me an answer. He just sat silently, staring at the floor. Finally, after a long while, he said, "Chaplain, pray for me. I've done some bad things." That was the closest he ever came to sharing his dark side with me. Billy just couldn't go there. It's been suggested that we are formed by the stories we tell ourselves. That is to say, our behavior is deeply influenced by, or maybe even determined by, the narratives we use to give meaning to our experiences. If we want to change our behavior, we have to change the narrative that we tell ourselves. As I was driving down the mountain from Billy's house that day, I thought about the myths I've created to make sense of my own pain and flawed humanity. I wondered what stories would my friends tell to remember me? What stories do I tell myself that are currently shaping my behavior? The shadow knows. In his work with the terminally ill, Canadian psychiatrist Harvey Chochinov observed that people's perceptions of themselves can have a profound influence on their experience of dying. Over the years, he developed what he calls dignity therapy to help patients express their lives from their own conditioned perspective. In short, he simply encourages people to tell their own stories. My own observation is when dying people can tell their own stories with humility and honesty, sharing not just their joys and triumphs, but also their shadow sides, without excuses or shame, they're much more at peace with the whole process of dying. The reality is, the shadow is part of each person's story. Why do we run from our shadows? Well, I once heard a fascinating lecture by Father Richard Rohr explaining this very subject. Drawing insights from the work of Carl Jung, Rohr suggested our dark sides, our demons, have much to teach us about ourselves. When we ignore and repress them, said Rohr, we actually stunt our spiritual growth. Thomas More, another Jungian disciple, goes even further. The uniqueness of a person is made up of the insane and the twisted as much as it is of the rational and the normal, says More. Now, Rohr and More are not suggesting that we just give in and grab whatever forbidden fruit our flawed false selves desire in search for some momentary pleasure, but they're advising that we sit with our sins, contemplate them, and listen to what they're trying to tell us about our wounded humanity. In other words, we need to embrace our shadow selves to make friends with them, and in so doing, to disarm them. According to this insight, Billy's alcoholism was evidence of a parched soul aching to be quenched. What was Billy thirsty for? I don't know. And it's not important that I know the answer for Billy. The more pertinent question is, What am I thirsty for? What are my addictive, out-of-control behaviors trying to tell me? Rather than fear these flaws in my soul and hide from them, maybe I should try to listen to them. When we refuse to face our fears, we actually empower them. I don't know if I learned this from reading Buddhist texts or from 12-step meetings, but it's true. What we resist persists. The more energy we put into not talking about something unpleasant or not facing a difficulty in our lives, the more we feed that issue and give it power over us. This truth reveals some of the genius behind the Roman Catholic sacrament of reconciliation. In the sacrament, a person is encouraged to tell the truth, to face the reality of one's sins or flaws head-on without flinching, naming them, and bringing them into the light of day with the aid of an accepting, trusted advisor. There can be so much healing in simply stating the worst about ourselves to another person and receiving that person's loving acceptance in return. Many of the dying people I've been with have taught me that the really difficult issues become more manageable if we come out and just talk about them. When we do this, those issues lose their power over us. Unfortunately, in religious settings, talk about sin often causes feelings of shame and condemnation rather than the soul liberation that flows from the loving acceptance of God. As a result, all our fire and brimstone preaching has produced are over-scrupulous nitpickers. As one who has been on both sides of the pulpit, as a preacher and a sinner, I've discovered that trying to please God by being good is a fool's game. We can never earn God's love by doing more good things than bad things. Spiritually speaking, good enough never is. Instead, it's a ruthless taskmaster always demanding more. As the Apostle Paul asserted in his exasperated cry from the 7th chapter of his letter to the Romans, "It happens so regularly that it's predictable. The moment I decide to do good, sin is there to trip me up. I truly delight in God's commands, but it's pretty obvious that not all of me joins in that delight. Parts of me covertly rebel, and just when I least expect it, they take charge. I've tried everything, and nothing helps. I'm at the end of my rope. Is there no one who can do anything for me? Isn't that the real question? The answer, thank God, is that Jesus Christ can and does." Suffice it to say, this deep awareness of our own sin, like grief, can either be a liberating awakening or a condemning experience that leads to greater isolation. What makes the difference? I suggest it is this awful grace of God, this grace wrapped in pain but with liberating power. My experience is when people are seized by this awful grace, they become reconciled to themselves, which enables them to be reconciled with others. This grace, this loving acceptance of God, frees us to rewrite the narratives that have enslaved us for years. Change, authentic change from the inside out, is now possible. A new internal script for living becomes available, one that is inclusive rather than exclusive, one that is compassionate rather than condemning. Thomas Merton is one of my most trusted spiritual guides. Merton was a Catholic monk who spent more than 25 years living behind the walls of a monastery in Kentucky, trying to become holy. Near the end of his life, he gave up trying to be better than other people and wrote, thank God, God, I'm only another member of the human race like all the rest of them. Merton discovered that our flaws are what connect us to each other. It's like humanity is one big 12-step group. Hello, my name is Fred, and I'm a sinner. I belong. When Billy would share about his faith, he often left me with the feeling that he was trying to talk himself into believing it was all true, that at least he wasn't as bad as other people, and more importantly, that God really loved him. I wonder if the impetus compelling Billy to his frequent and loud verbal declarations of faith in Jesus was Billy's deep-seated hatred of himself, a self-loathing that gave evidence of Billy's estrangement from himself. What are you doing here? Like Billy, I spent many years in my own practice of Christianity attempting to earn God's love and acceptance. I know what it is to love God with all of your heart and hate yourself. I was first seized by the love of Jesus when I was 19 years of age. Before that time, I had really no sexual experiences I can remember. Later that year, I woke up in the middle of a wet dream one night, and then I realized what everyone had been talking about during my teenage years. In no time at all, I became addicted to pornography and masturbation. I know the feeling of an unforeseen force welling up from inside and compelling you to make choices against your heart's desire. I remember times as a spirit-filled believer, I would go to triple X-rated theaters in New York City and masturbate while watching sexual acts on screen. What I find so amazing is that even there, grace came to me. As I sat in the darkness of those theaters, overwhelmed by fear and shame, the beloved's voice would come to me and say, "What are you doing here? What are you doing here?" The words were not spoken in condemnation, but in compassion, not in rejection, but in acceptance. I know the feeling of leaving places like that, terrified you'll run into someone you know. I know what it is to love God with all of your heart and hate yourself. But I also know what it is to be forgiven and liberated by grace. Psychologist Thomas More writes, "A soulful life is never without shadow, and some of the soul's power comes from its shadow qualities. If we want to live from our depths soulfully, then we will have to give up all pretenses to innocence as the shadow grows darker. The chief reward of surrendering innocence, so that the soul may be fully expressed, is an increase of power. In the presence of deep power, life becomes robust and passionate, signs that the soul is engaged and being given expression. According to Moore, embracing the shadow helps life become robust and passionate. One of the ways we achieve this is by embracing our dark sides and sharing them with others. This honest self-disclosure helps create space for deeper relationships with others, for community. As we slay the giant of self-hatred, we also till the hardened soil of our souls and become fertile for truly loving relationships.